Midnight in the Luzon Strait. A young American skipper leans into the eyepiece and decides, alone, to take on a convoy twice his size. He is one of barely 16,000 men in the silent service, about 2% of the U.S. Navy. Yet his community will sink over half of Japan's merchant shipping and more than 1,300 enemy vessels. Radar paints blips, the TDC hums, and the periscope feathers the water like a shark's fin. The order is quiet. Fire 1, fire 2. Seconds later, steel disappears, cargo flames, and an empire's lifeline kinks. Here is the oar. 2% did half the work. American submarines would account for roughly 55% of Japan's merchant losses and about 5.3 million tons sent to the bottom. The boats did it in 3s and 4s, hundreds of miles from help, using math, nerve, and American freedom to improvise. They attacked at night on the surface with SJ radar like cat's eyes, then dove through prop wash to slip away. They learned fast, argued hard, and were rewarded for results, not for following the last memo. Let remember Pearl Harbor be our battle cry, Rear Admiral John H. Newton wrote as sailors walked the burned piers. Chester W. Nimitz set the tone in October. 1942. Faith in God is the ultimate inspiration for victory. Those aren't slogans, they are marching orders and moral ballast. They told young skippers exactly how to fight, with calm, with purpose, with initiative that answers treachery with excellence. Meet radioman second-class Joe Carter, a composite of many hands who made victory possible. He could count a convoy by ear, slow tankers thudding like heavy drums, escorts snapping fast, and whisper ranges to the captain in the red glow of the control room. Sweat ran, pencils scratched, the boat slid closer. He never fired a torpedo, but he made the shots possible. Range closing, Captain, he'd murmur, and a nation's promise moved with it. Across the sea, Japanese omarid, planners felt the loss in empty tanks and silent mills. Ore from the Indies stalled. Rice ships failed to appear. Destroyers peeled off from task forces to chase ghosts they could not see. The arithmetic turned ugly and stayed that way. Remember the human scale inside the statistics. Each victory pennant painted under a submarine's fair water stood for nights of sweat and cold coffee, for bearings called right, for a chief who caught a rattle before it became a flood. The math was national, but the courage was personal. America won this part of the war not with speeches but with watchbills, drills, and quiet men who let results speak. The punch that carries us forward is simple and thunderous. A small American tribe sank a nation's sea power with brains and steel, and they are just getting started. He walked the wreckage at Pearl Harbor with smoke in his lungs and anger in his eyes. Rear Admiral John H. Newton sent a message that still stings. Let remember Pearl Harbor be our battle cry. The silent service heard it and went west. Boats cleared Diamond Head with torpedoes in the racks and a prayer in the heart. Not for revenge alone, but for a new kind of war patient. Exact, merciless to enemy logistics, merciful to men in the water when it was safe. The context was brutal and simple. Japan lived by sea lanes that stretched like thin veins from the Indies to Honshu. Cut them and factories starved. Cut them and fleets ran dry. American submarines became scalpels. With SJ radar and the TDC, a skipper could read a convoy's geometry like a music score and place warheads at the measure's downbeat. Nimitz's leadership turned that resolve into a method. He picked fighting admirals, empowered Charles Lockwood to shape the submarine force, and demanded results, not excuses. He kept the refit cycle tight and the logistics tidy so boats could hunt, repair, and hunt again. He rewarded boldness and relieved timidity. This was American management at war, calm, accountable, and fast. Carpenter's mate Frank Martinez, call him every enlisted fixer you've never heard of, made that speed real. In a sweltering forward compartment, he could repack a leaky shaft seal with greasy fingers while the boat rocked at periscope depth. He'd wipe his hands, grin at the chief, and say, "She'll hold." And then the skipper would push the speed that made the geometry work. Refit piers from Fremantle to Pearl learned a rhythm. Compressors hissed, torpedoes slid into forward rooms, diesel exhaust hung sweet and deadly in the dawn. Yard workers in denim hammered, rewired and calibrated, then slapped the hull as if sending a friend to a prize fight. The cycle tightened from months to weeks. That speed came from American industry at home and American trust at sea, a straight line from a machinist in Manitowoc to a periscope off Formosa. Across the water, the enemy expected a shattered fleet to cower behind battleships. Instead, the quiet boats came at night, and in rain squalls, appeared ahead of convoys, and vanished into thermoclines. Japanese staffs realized this enemy did not wait for orders from a big ship's bridge. He used ideas like weapons. He learned after each patrol and came back smarter. The bridge to what comes next is the American promise to fix what is broken and to prove it with data. We were about to discover our main weapon did not work the way it should. We would not write memos. We would fire shots into a cliff, measure the truth, and change the war's curve. That is the moment the silent service turned stubborn faith into engineering muscle and the sinkings soared. 3 torpedoes left the tubes with a hiss and a prayer and went dead, or worse, detonated early as the destroyer knifed in. How do you win a sea war when your primary weapon fails? The Mark 14 ran too deep. The magnetic Mark 6 exploder misfired. The contact pistol crushed instead of triggered. Skippers came back angry. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood told them to bring proof, not grief, and he backed them to the hilt. Proof came in salt and thunder. Live warshots slammed into the basalt cliffs off Kahular. Depth settings were measured. Exploder parts were torn down on mess tables. The results were undeniable. The torpedoes were faulty by design and calibration. Lockwood hammered Washington, ordered fixes, and kept his hunters on station. The culture mattered. American officers could challenge bad assumptions, and enlisted men could show a rear admiral a bent firing pin without fear. Torpedoman's mate Henry Red Walker stands in for the men who bled for those fixes. He burned his hands lapping firing pins and shimming depth gears between attacks. He smelled oil and hot metal and the acidic bite of battery fumes, while the hull creaked under pressure. "Try it now," he'd say, handing up the reassembled pistol. The next spread struck true, and somewhere beyond the periscope glow a freighter tore open like a tin can. The fixes were not abstract. Depth cams were recut, exploder noses reshaped, firing pins hardened, gyro settings checked and checked again. Instructors wrote new procedures. Torpedo shops kept night hours like front lines. Patrol reports that once read like laments turned into playbooks of repeatable kills. Crews began to trust what left the tubes, and that trust let them press attacks deeper and stay a second longer on the scope. When the spray cleared, the scoreboard told the story. 1,944 would be a harvest. The enemy felt the change almost at once. Escorts who had begun to scoff at duds started seeing hits that blew bows off tankers and snapped keels. Japanese convoy doctrine, already thin, struggled to adjust. Destroyers turned back for rescue and turned into targets. The sea, once hard for the hunter, was now harder for the hunted. The bridge forward is a promise kept in steel. Once the weapon worked, the curve bent up like a launch. Sinkings multiplied through. Late 1,943 and 1,944. The boats came home with victory pennants bristling, then went out again, faster and bolder. The problem had been brutal and basic. The answer was American as a wrench and a field test. And now an officer named Richard O'Kane was about to turn geometry into art and make the night itself a weapon. He would teach a fleet to attack twice before dawn and vanish by sunrise, leaving only oil slicks and stunned radio men behind. Black water, no moon, and a line of merchants throwing white bow waves near the Bungo Swedo approaches. Lieutenant Commander Richard H. O'Kane in USS Tang, SS 306, orders a surface end-around, racing at flank to get ahead, then knifing in across the convoy's track. He will attack twice before dawn and still be gone by sunrise. The periscope view is a stuttering postcard, prows, Masts, slashes of spray, yet his mind is calm and exact. This is the revelation. American boats turned night surface attacks into a repeatable craft. SJ radar gave range and bearing. The TDC solved angles at speed. Disciplined lookouts and a steady helmsman made the approach like threading a needle in a storm. O'Kane wrote the playbook on USS Wahoo under Mush Morton and perfected it in Tang. He trusted his crew to move like one machine and trusted his right to decide in the moment. Then fate cut back. On the 25th of October 1944, after a blistering patrol in the Formosa Strait, Tang's own torpedoes circled and struck her stern. Men were blown into black water, others were trapped deep. O'Kane survived, captured and held as a POW, carrying with him the doctrine he had burned into the fleet. "We will do our duty," he said later, simple words for a hard truth. His crew was a gallery of American skill, a quartermaster riding the chart like a dance partner, a helmsman with wrists of stone, a chief of the boat who could settle a compartment with a glance, the boat itself. Balau-class steel, 4 Fairbanks Morse diesels, 10 21-inch tubes was a promise that Detroit and Pittsburgh were in the fight. O'Kane's months in captivity could not erase what he had taught others. Attack again, and do it faster. When news of Tang's loss reached the piers, sailors did not lose the method. They sharpened it. For the enemy, the shock was the direction of death. Escorts expected torpedoes from behind. Instead, the kill shots came from ahead, delivered by a sub running on the surface in 30 knots of night wind. Searchlights stabbed empty water. Depth charges boiled seas where no American boat remained. The convoy system, late to form, was late to adjust. The final punch is the handoff to audacity squared. If O'Kane made the dark a weapon, another skipper would make the shoreline a target and the harbour a hunting ground. The technology remained the same: radar, TDC, the lean shape of a Balau hull, but the imagination grew teeth. The next act would ask a mad question and then answer it with speed. Can a submarine raid a defended anchorage and live? Eugene Fluckey was about to show how. His patrol reports read like engineering poetry ranges, tracks, gyros, yet every line throbbed with the same American idea: think, decide, strike, and disappear. The destroyer was built to kill him, but Commander Sam Dealey in USS Harder, SS 257, hunted it anyway. Off Tawi-Tawi in 1944, he took on Japanese anti-sub escorts, firing from knife range, diving under counterattack, and coming back for more. In 5 blistering weeks, Harder sank 5 destroyers and crippled a 6th, wrecking the very screen meant to guard convoys and the fleet. The predator and the prey had swapped names. Here is the revelation that stuns. American skippers did not just survive destroyers, they ambushed them. With radar plots and instincts honed by dozens of approaches, Dealey used the impatient habits of his enemies against them. He let them charge, then put warheads in the water at the last second, turning speed into blindness. The result was fear in the hunter's heart. A boatswain's mate named Tom Riley represents the hands that made courage routine. He stood at the bow planes while rivets sang, calling out depth and angle as ashcans rolled overhead. He heard the hull ping like a bell and kept his voice low and even. Steady up 10. Hold her, now. When Harder bobbed back to periscope depth and the destroyer's funnel lay on the water, he allowed himself one quiet word: home. For the enemy, shock turned strategic. Escorts diverted from convoys to form hunter, killer groups, and burned precious fuel at flank, often to find nothing. Commanders learned that a single American submarine could stall operations across an entire sea lane. Morale frayed. A doctrine designed for set-piece battles could not catch a knife-fighting foe who wrote his own rules. Dealey's 5th patrol read like a dare. Off Tawi-Tawi and Sibutu Passage, he used periscope depth like a boxer's crouch, taking angles no manual praised, trusting timing and crew. 5 destroyers in weeks was not only tonnage, it was terror. Japanese vice admirals had to rewrite sailing orders and burn fuel they could not spare, forming screens that still leaked. And always, behind the statistics, there were hands on valves and wheels, eyes that did not blink, and a country that sent fresh parts and new boats faster than the enemy could adapt. The bridge to the next leap is a question we would not have dared in 1942 and could answer by 1944. If destroyers can be stalked, what about capital ships? Somewhere ahead in a narrow strait, a long, low shadow will cross a radar screen. An American crew will track it in the dark, fire, and feel the ocean heave under a battleship's death. And after that night, even the biggest guns in the Pacific will mean less than a handful of well-aimed torpedoes and the men who dared to shoot them. 20 inches, the Formosa Strait, the 21st of November 1944, USS Celian, SS 315, feels a long, slow echo on the SJ set, and a bigger heartbeat comes back through the hull. The target is the battleship Congo with destroyer Urakaze in company, heavy metal moving fast for the home islands. Commander Eli T. Reich lines up the track, fires a cold, perfect spread, and the sea lifts as if a mountain shrugged. Minutes later, Urakaze is gone too. Can one submarine really kill a battleship at sea? The answer came in flame and shock. Congo rolled and broke and sank with more than 1,000 men. Urakaze followed her into the black. It was the only time in the war a US boat sank a battleship underway. It proved that stealth and geometry could flip the old order of naval power, even in open water, even at night. Seaman First Class Pete Novak, 19 and Nebraska-born, clutched the periscope shears and listened to the crew count bearing drift in clipped whispers. He smelled hot dust and damp canvas, heard the TDC's soft churn, and felt the deck jump under his boots when the first hit landed. "That's her," he breathed, not cheering yet, just certain. When the second ship blew, he thought of home. Across the line of departure, the shock hit hard. If battleships could not cross a strait without dying to an unseen enemy, merchantmen had no chance. Japanese captains chose longer, fuel-wasting routes or hugged coasts, where shoals and mines narrowed their options. Every decision bled strength. The myth of invulnerability cracked in a single hour of American calm and skill. Reich did not crow. He logged the facts, turned for deep water, and lived to fight again. Celian's patrol report went across desks in Pearl, where cool men nodded because it confirmed what they believed. Initiative at the edge beats theory at a table. In wardrooms around the Pacific, skippers underlined the track and told their execs, "We can do this," and the war moved a step faster toward its end. The legend of big gun invincibility died that night, replaced by the modern truth that brains, bearings, and grit beat armor and myth. A few months later, another skipper would push the logic further into a mined harbor, onto a beach, even under a set of train tracks on the enemy's own soil. The submarine had become not just a hunter of ships, but a writer of history with a pencil made of steel and a signature that read, United States Navy. American crews absorbed the lesson down to muscle memory. Close quietly, shoot straight, change depth, change course, and let the enemy waste fury on empty water. The radios stayed terse. The pride lived in the next assignment and the next clean wake. Night air bit like ice as USS Barb slid into Namquan Harbor on the China coast, January 23-24, 1945. Commander Eugene B. Fluckey stood on the bridge in spray and darkness and did the unthinkable. He took a submarine at flank speed into a mined, shallow anchorage packed with ships at anchor and patrol craft circling. Radar gave ranges, the TDC solved tracks, and the crew fired a fan of torpedoes that turned the harbor into a chain of orange flowers. Enemy searchlights clawed the black, but Barb leapt back out at over 23 knots, the diesels howling like victory, her wake foaming white over the mine line. That single patrol would earn Fluckey the Medal of Honor and teach the fleet a fierce lesson. Stealth plus American initiative could hit any target, even under the enemy's guns. The revelation is simple and devastating. Our boats did not just wait in deep water. They went where odds said no, used gear like tools in a carpenter's belt, and trusted crews who could turn numbers into kills. Seaman Gunner's mate Jack Higgins whispered, "Range steady, sir," while the deck shook with shock waves and the smell of cordite and diesel oil mixed like a bitter perfume. "We don't quit," another sailor muttered, steadying a handwheel as tracers stitched the horizon. On the far pier, Japanese sentries learned that even their harbors were not safe from American reach. Panic lit radios. Escorts burned fuel in wild chases. The sense of sanctuary died in a single night. The bridge forward is a dare only Americans would try next. If a harbor can be hit, what about the railroad feeding it? Flucky looked at a beach, a tunnel, a thin ribbon of track, and asked a question that felt like a joke at first. Can a submarine sink a train? The answer would become the kind of fact that sounds like a myth until you see the patrol flag stitched with a tiny locomotive. We were about to turn ingenuity into legend, and we would do it with 8 sailors, a rubber boat, and a charge that waited like a tiger in the dark. The 23rd of July 1945, Sakhalin's night smelled of wet grass and cold iron as Barb's shore party slid from rubber boats and crawled toward the rails. Commander Flucky had made a hard rule for the raid, no married men, and sent 8 bachelors with a micro-primed charge wired to a wooden trigger. They buried it under the track bed, felt the tremor first, then the thunder. A Japanese train hurtled into the trap and exploded into a rolling ball of sparks and splinters. The sailors sprinted back to the surf, laughing like men who couldn't believe they were still alive, and by sunrise Barb was a thin grey line on the horizon. It was the only ground operation on the Japanese home islands carried out by a US submarine crew, and it broke more than rail. It broke the idea that anything ashore was beyond American reach. The revelation lands with steel weight. Barb had already fired 5-inch rockets from her deck to lash coastal targets. Now a submarine had destroyed a train. Sea power had stepped over the beach. Torpedoman Al Shorty Pierce, still breathing hard in the forward room, kept the story simple. We left a present. They opened it. Coxswain. Billy Walker scrawled in pencil, hands shaking, saw the engine lift, sounded like the sky split. Even in war, the enemy's shock carried a human shape. Villagers stared at twisted rails. Sentries shouted and pointed out to sea where nothing remained but smoke and gulls. The lesson traveled faster than rumors. American sailors could appear where maps said they could not. Bridges, depots, and harbors felt suddenly close to the waterline. The bridge into what comes next is numbers, not noise. Daring was never a sideshow. It was one face of a larger strategy: sink the ships that fed the empire, choke its factories, starve its armies of oil. We will leave the beach for the sea lanes again, and follow the math the way a hunter follows tracks. The story is about to widen from one crew's audacity to a nation's grip on the enemy's throat, from a single roaring train to whole convoys that never reached home. A factory foreman in Tokyo pulled a lever, and nothing moved. Not because men were lazy, but because ore never made it off a sunk freighter. That was the American design. Submarines aimed at tankers and freighters first, then at anything that tried to guard them, until the sea lanes clotted with fear and wreckage. By 1945, the Japanese merchant marine was a ghost of itself. Sailings grew thin, routes bent around danger, and fuel burned in detours that solved nothing. US submarines accounted for the majority of Japan's merchant losses, over half of all tonnage sent down, and more than 1,300 ships by war's end. The revelation turns into a daily grind of genius. Intelligence from code-breaking and contact reports fed patrol boxes. Radar ranges and hydrophone notes became ambushes. Torpedo loads shifted toward proven exploders. Refits clicked like assembly lines so boats could kill, reload, and kill again. In a control room that smelled of sweat and coffee, Quartermaster Leo Cho traced convoy routes on grease pencil and said, "They have to pass here." He was right, again and again. No rice. A guard complained to an American POW. No ships. Prisoners heard the Empire's heartbeat slow in those presentos. Small, bitter sentences. The enemy's shock came in patterns. Escorts left battle fleets to ride herd on tankers. Destroyers burned fuel and time-guarding ships that still disappeared under black water. Shipyards tried to replace hulls and failed because steel is slower than a torpedo and planning dies under pressure. American dominance now looked like math on a chalkboard and oil burning on a tide at dawn. The bridge into the next turn of the screw is mercy, not malice. Our submarines did something fierce and strange. They surfaced under enemy airfields and pulled downed American aviators from the sea. The same boats that starved an empire also saved hundreds of lives at pistol range of hostile beaches. That is a moral shock the enemy never expected and a truth our crews wore like a quiet badge. We go from strangling the arteries to rescuing the hearts, and we do both with the same calm hands on the same brass wheels. The ocean was slate and the wind bit hard when USS Finback surfaced near Chichijima on the 2nd of September 1944. A young pilot thrashed in his raft, oil in his eyes, ribs aching, sure that he was done. Finback swung close, lines arced, hands reached, and Ensign George H.W. Bush came aboard, shaking and alive. The boat dove before fighters could pounce. Down in the warm electric glow of the control room, someone pushed a mug of coffee into freezing hands. That was lifeguard duty. Submarines parked under enemy air umbrellas to rescue downed flyers, sometimes within sight of shore batteries. The revelation glows brighter because it sits next to danger. U.S. submarines rescued hundreds of aviators, over 500 souls, pulled from the hard blue edge of death, while still hunting convoys between calls. Torpedoes and kindness shared the same steel decks. Didn't think I'd see Kansas again. A rescued gunner whispered, cheek salt, streaked, as a pharmacist's mate wrapped his shoulder. You boys are angels with diesel breath. Coxswain Ray, McAllister kept his eyes on the sea and muttered, we do what we came to do. The enemy's shock lived at 2 wavelengths. Pilots who bailed out did not vanish. They came back to fight again. Patrol boats that raced to capture them often found an American submarine's deck gun leveled instead. A force designed to sink ships had become a lifeline that made carriers bolder and strikes deeper. It was strategy with a human face. The bridge to the reckoning is cost. These rescues happened under shellfire and dive bombers. Our boats took hits, carried wounded, and still went back to the hunt, and many did not return from either job. 52 submarines were lost in the Pacific War. Over 3,500 men never came home. Highest casualty rate in the Navy. We saved lives and paid with our own. That is the ledger no one forgets when the engines go quiet and the wake flattens behind the stern at sunset. A gold star in a farmhouse window in Nebraska. A folded flag in a row house in Boston. 52 submarines gone. More than 3,500 American submariners lost, the highest casualty rate of any branch in the war, near 1 in 5. The price was as real as cold steel. The revelation hurts and humbles. Names echo. USS Wahoo, last heard from in 1,943 inches, the Sea of Japan. USS Harder, lost after her string of destroyer kills off Tawi Tawi. USS Tang, sunk by her own circling torpedo after a masterpiece patrol. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood said of his men, they went where the enemy was. Captives carried the war in silence. Richard O'Kane, Tang's skipper, endured prison and hunger, and still told younger sailors, do your duty. A POW remembered a guard, snarling, no ships, no rice. And he understood in that instant what his friends at sea had done. In control rooms across the Pacific, chiefs posted the list of boats overdue, and the mess went quiet. Helm wheels turned anyway. The enemy's shock was arithmetic, they could not change. They scored victories against individual boats, yes, but the flow of American steel did not stop. New Ballau-class hulls slid down ways. Crews trained, loaded and sailed with the lessons of the lost etched into their drills. Every depth-keeping check, every exploder test, every tight refit was a memorial in motion. The bridge to the final chapter is a ledger written in 2 inks. One line reads sacrifice that never ends. The other line reads victory that changed the world. The United States did not claim perfection. It claimed responsibility and results. We outthought, outbuilt, and outfought an empire at sea, and we remember the price with every patrol flag that carries a black star among the ship silhouettes. The payoff ahead is the impossible math made simple. 2% of the Navy, more than half the enemy's merchant losses, capital ships sunk, pilots saved, and an island empire starved into stillness. A staff officer spread the endgame on a single page, and it looked unreal even to him. U.S. Submarines sank more than 1,000. 300 enemy ships about 1,000. 314 by best wartime count, and roughly 5.3 million tons of Japanese shipping. They sank the battleship Congo in the Formosa Strait. They put the carriers Taiho and Shokaku down in 1944, tore open heavy cruisers Atago and Maya in Palawan Passage, and made oilers vanish like morning mist. And all of it was done by about 16,000 men, near 2% of the Navy, operating in steel tubes in hostile water, patrol after patrol. The revelation is not one number. It is the shape those numbers drew. Starved factories, silent transport piers, carrier strikes that ranged deeper because subs emptied the sea of fuel, 29 missions that launched without fear of a fresh fleet waiting at sea. Let remember Pearl Harbor be our battle cry. An admiral wrote in the ashes, and the silent service answered with a 4-year echo that ended in victory. Faith in God is the ultimate inspiration for victory, Nimitz said, and the crews turned that faith into bearings and angles and courage. A machinist's mate could point to a depth cam, a torpedoman to a hardened firing pin, a quartermaster to a grease-penciled plot and say, "This is how we won." The enemy's last shock was quiet. No convoys, no fuel, no chance. In the final months, merchantmen hugged coasts like frightened birds, destroyers prowled empty sea, shipyards stared at shortages they could not solve. The empire had been cut free from its food and its fire. The closing punch binds every chapter. 2% of our Navy delivered more than half the enemy's merchant losses, 52 boats and over 3,500 lives paid the bill. A battleship, carriers, cruisers, troopships, tankers all down to math, steel, and American freedom to adapt. We did not simply fight. We proved that a free people with tools in their hands and trust in their leaders can take the hardest problem on earth and solve it under fire. Holy truth. We actually did that. And the ocean remembers.